Hi guys, how have you been? Some of you must have had a great time in the last few days, at least those who celebrate Diwali. And I think some of you must be looking forward to Thanksgiving, which is coming up soon. And people in India, are you all set for the match tomorrow? I'm sure you're excited. Well, I am, and a little nervous too. But in any case, festivities and celebrations should continue. It doesn't matter, you shouldn't stop them just because you're preparing for GMAT. But then please do realize that GMAT preparation should also not stop during the festivities. In case you're really hard pressed for time, then just maybe read for an hour the book that you've started, or perhaps solve just a few questions of quant. So in any case, you'll feel that you've accomplished something. Yeah. So don't stop those during all these celebrations, and of course celebrate as well. Have fun there as so today we are going to we're going to discuss conditional statements. Now, these are tested in critical reasoning, and of course, they form a part of data sufficiency as well. We have discussed these in detail. I hope you've gone through the video and the module as well on conditional statements. For GMAT, more relevant are the necessary conditions because sometimes they'll give those to you in the argument, and the flaw will be that, for example, they're going to assume that it is sufficient for, if you say X is necessary for Y, they're going to assume that X is sufficient for Y to take place, and etc. So those kind of things they normally give in GMAT, but of course we have to be prepared with everything, right? So I'll take a quick review of a couple of important points and then we'll start with some questions. These questions are going to be all a little tricky. So be prepared for like 700 plus level. But let's quickly take a look at a couple of important points first. So here goes. First of all, as I said, necessary conditions are tested more often, right? Now, it doesn't matter how the statement is given to me. So, for example, let's say I have X and Y, or I have not X, not Y. These are my statements, yeah? Or I have YX, or I have not Y, not X. Notice the equivalency between the statements. Here, if, here, only if, here, only if, and here, if. All these four are equivalent statements, yeah? If X is sufficient for Y to happen, then Y is necessary for X. Also, not X is necessary for not Y, and not Y is sufficient for not X. Yeah, this is X. Yeah. These are all equivalent statements. So then in case we have something with a lot of negatives, etc., all you have to do is you have to figure out what is necessary for what. So for example, if I have a statement like, if say she doesn't like the cake, yeah, a very simple example we'll take. He will not eat it. Yeah. So if she doesn't like the cake, so you know what I think, she will not eat it. The way I see it is, this is my not Y and not X. So then, what is necessary for what? Liking the cake. I'll tell myself, liking the cake, this is necessary for eating, for her. Yeah? Necessary for eating. So basically, I'll convert the sentence. I'll try to find out what is necessary for what, right? Another thing, something which does confuse people, in case you have unless or until, both the same. Yeah. Sometimes you have until and unless. So in any case, if you have unless X, Y, convert this to X is necessary for not Y. Yeah, negate this one and you say that X is necessary for not Y. So keep these two things in mind. We look at some questions. We look at a question which has unless as well. So it'll, show you how we're going to use this. Yeah. Let's go on to our first question. The way, we run the webinar is that I give you a question. For those of you who are new here, let me just quickly tell you how we'll run it. I'll give you a question. I'll give you 2 minutes to solve the question. And in case you get the answer, just share it with me on the Q&A, which has been enabled for you. And then we'll work on it together. So I'll tell you how exactly I would solve it, what comes to my mind when I read the particular statement. And after that, I'll give you, let's say, about 30 seconds to, in case you have any queries, to get all your doubts solved, etc. Yeah. And then we'll move on to the next question. So here is your first question. Try it out. I'll give you a couple of minutes for it. It is a historical fact that only in conditions of profound societal instability are great works of literature produced. So look at this, only in these conditions, instability, right, are great works of literature produced. So the first thing, when I read this first sentence, I tell myself, okay, this means that instability is necessary for profound, great works of literature. Okay, so for great literature, yeah. So great literature is produced only when this condition is met, when there is instability. All right. During the first century BC, Rome experienced almost constant civil war accompanied by social upheaval. So they're talking about the first century BC. So they're saying there was instability at this time. And it wasn't until the accession of Nerva to the throne in 96 AD that the situation stabilized throughout the second century AD. Okay, so 96 AD. So basically, they're saying that the first century AD also was unstable. And then the second century AD, because 96 AD is almost like the end of the first century, right? The night throughout the second century, Rome experienced a century of peace. So this is when there was peace, right? So this is the data that is given to us. If all the statements in the passage are true, then which of the following must also be true? So basically, we're looking for an inference, right? We're looking for what must be true based on what is given in the passage. So a conclusion, essentially, what has to be true based on the passage. Okay. Now, option A, during the first century BC, so we're talking about this one, great works of literature were produced in Rome. Look, I know that first century BC was on the time of instability, right? But then instability is necessary for great literature. Is it sufficient? Is it essential that every time there is instability, there will be great works of literature? No, that is not given to me. It is given to me that instability is necessary, right? And this is the way that GMAT will try to trap you. This is not essential. Great, in the first century BC, I know there was instability, but it's not essential that great works of literature were produced, right? Because instability is not sufficient to produce great works of literature. So this is not necessarily true. So this is incorrect, not our answer. Look at B. Roman art of the first century BC, again, we're talking about this one, was superior to Roman art of the second century AD. Second century AD is this one. Now, again, can we say that? It is not necessary, right? We don't know what kind of Roman art was produced in the first century or in the second century. For example, what if almost no art was produced in the first century and that was also not great, right? After all, instability is necessary, but it's not essential. It doesn't mean that every time there is instability, we'll get great works of literature, isn't it? And in any case, I mean, we're talking about, Roman art. Now, is it the same thing as literature? Not really sure either, right? So again, this is not correct. Yeah. Okay, see, during the second century AD, so now we're talking about this, no great works of literature were produced in Rome. This is correct. Why? Because during second century AD, there was peace. They say that there was no instability. Instability is necessary for great literature. Because there was no instability, I can say that there were no great pieces of literature in second century AD. So during the second century AD, no great works of literature were produced. This is correct. Yeah, this must be true, right? We'll still look at the other two options. Historically, great works of literature can stir emotions that find their expression in political action. Okay, this is out of scope, right? It has nothing to do with our argument. Leave it. The first century AD was a time of decreased literary production in Rome. First century AD was a time of decreased literary production. We don't really know anything about the first century, right? We can't really say it whether the literary production decreased, whether it was more in first century BC. Nothing actually is mentioned about the first century AD. So anyway, this also makes no sense. So our correct option is C. This is our answer, right? Okay, I'll give you a few seconds in case anyone has any questions. Put them down in Q&A and I'll answer. Otherwise, we'll move on to the next question. This was a relatively easy one. Yeah? We're coming up with some really difficult ones ahead. Fun, not difficult. Let's call them fun. Okay, cognitive scientist. Using the pioneering work of comparative psychologist Gordon Gallup as the model, several studies have investigated. So there have been studies. Yeah, think about it. Now, look, when I look at the argument, I try to make a mental picture of it, right? So try to look at that. There are several studies, and it is based on some model by some psychologist given. Yeah. So, based on that model, they have created some studies and then they carried out those studies. They have investigated animals' capacity for mirror self-recognition. So we'll call it MSR, mirror self-recognition. So the studies basically must have put, now this is what we are guessing, right? Now what I'm imagining is that there is a mirror and the studies put animals in front of the mirror and then, they analyzed what kind of a behavior the animal is displaying, right? Whether the animal is able to recognize themselves in the mirror or whatever. So now most animals exposed to a mirror respond only with social behavior such as aggression. So they respond with social behavior such as aggression. However, in the case of the great apes, repeated exposure to mirrors leads to self-directed behaviors such as, so apes show self-directed behaviors such as exploring the inside of the mouth, suggesting that these animals recognize the reflection as an image of self. So basically, most animals they respond with social behaviors such as aggression, where they don't recognize that it is their image. They don't recognize that it is the animal itself. Whereas great apes, they show self-directed behaviors, repeated exposure, then they show self-directed behavior where they're exploring their own mouth, whatever. So they are basically, it's suggesting that these animals recognize that they are the ones that they can see in the mirror. Yeah. The implication of these studies is that now here comes our conclusion, right? This is all about the study. What did the study do, and what did the study show, etc. Now, this is the implication. So, this is what the author is inferring from the argument, from the data given to us. The implication of these studies is that the great apes have a capacity for self-awareness unique among non-human species. Now, look, sometimes we get confused in the terminology used. We don't realize that there are different terminologies being used in the premises and in the conclusion, and this is one big example of that. So here, we're talking about mirror self-recognition, MSR. We are saying that great apes recognize, let's just quickly write down. We say that great apes show MSR. That is what the studies give us, right? They are able to recognize themselves in the mirror. Other animals, they do not show let's say no MSR, right? Other animals do not recognize. What is the conclusion here then? Great apes have a capacity for self-awareness. Now, that's not the same as self-recognition in a mirror, right? We are we are concluding that the great apes have self-awareness. So our conclusion is great apes show self-awareness. Let me write this as essay. And others do not show self-awareness. Because he says great apes have a capacity for self-awareness unique among non-human species. So based on this MSR, based on the studies, he's saying that great apes show self-awareness and others do not show self-awareness, right? So basically what he means to say is that others do not show self-awareness. That means that MSR is necessary. He's assuming MSR is necessary for self-awareness, right? He's also assuming that MSR is sufficient for self-awareness. Does that make sense? Because great apes show MSR, so he's concluding that great apes show self-awareness. So he's assuming that MSR is sufficient for self-awareness. If you show MSR, that means you are self-aware. And because other animals are not showing MSR, he's concluding that others do not have self-awareness. So he's saying MSR is necessary, right? MSR is necessary for self-awareness because other animals are not showing MSR. That is why they are not self-aware. So basically, he's assuming both these things to arrive at this particular conclusion. And normally, these conditional statements, they get really confusing when we have assumption questions. Assumption questions themselves are a little tricky, right? They get even more difficult when we have these statements. All right. So now we've understood what basically he's assuming. Let's look at the options now. The scientist makes which of the following assumptions? So A, Gallup's work has established that the great apes have a capacity for MSR unique among non. This is not assumed, right? Gallup's work is only a model on which the studies were based, then studies showed something. So he's not assuming anything about what Gallup's work established, right? For all we know, Gallup's work didn't even mention the great apes, right? So, of course, this is not the conclusion. Okay, B. If an animal does not have the capacity for MSR, it does not have the capacity for self-awareness. As we said, this is something that he has assumed. He's saying MSR is necessary for self-awareness, right? Which means that if the animal does not have the capacity for MSR, then it does not have the capacity for self-awareness, isn't it, right? This is something that he has assumed, right? He has assumed both that MSR is necessary as well as that MSR is sufficient. So he's saying that if you don't have MSR, then that means you don't have self-awareness. It is an assumption he has made. Okay, let's look at the other options also. If a researcher exposes an animal to a mirror and that animal exhibits social behavior, that animal is incapable of being self-aware. Look, you might feel that, this is an assumption, but it is not. He says the argument tells us that upon repeated exposure, right? So it is also possible here. Look, great apes upon repeated exposure. So then it is possible that the first time that the great apes were put in front of the mirror, they did not show, they showed social behavior. It's quite possible they showed aggression. And then repeated exposure, finally they realized that it's they themselves in the mirror, right? So this is not necessary for a conclusion. If a researcher exposes an animal to a mirror, that animal is incapable of being self-aware, it's not necessary for a conclusion, right? It's not an assumption. D. When exposed to a mirror, all animals display either social behavior or self-directed behavior. Again, this is not necessary. We are only linking the self-directed behavior to self-awareness in our assumption, right? It is possible that there is some other kind of look, he says most animals display social behavior. Great apes display self-directed behavior. Maybe there are one or two animals that, for example, don't display any behavior. They just, stay as they are. That's also possible, isn't it? That doesn't change our conclusion at all. We are only talking about those who show self-directed behavior, MSR that is, and those who do not show MSR. So everyone else, social behavior, no behavior, whatever, will lie in the no MSR category, right? Other animals, no MSR. So all of them will lie in the same category. Nothing changes in our conclusion. So this is also not not an assumption. Last one. Animals that do not exhibit MSR may demonstrate a capacity for self-awareness in other ways. In fact, this is the opposite of our assumption. We are saying if they are not showing MSR, that means they are not self-aware, isn't it? Right? This is what we are saying. This is our assumption. We are not assuming that the ones who do not show MSR, they may exhibit self-awareness in other ways. right? We are concluding something absolutely opposite to this, opposite to this. So this is not an assumption that we have, right? So our answer is going to be B over here, right? Does this make sense? It is one of the tougher questions. It is a question that I have to come back to again and again. You know, the learners do have a tough time understanding it, and that is the reason why I decided to take it in a video format, so that it is a little easier to understand. So in case there are any questions,